Stop the car right now. The words flew out of my mouth such fury that my husband nearly slammed on the brakes in the middle of our quiet suburban street. We were just pulling into our own driveway after a wonderful 2-week anniversary trip to Ireland, and something was terribly, horribly wrong with our house. The front door that had been painted a warm sage green for 15 years was now bright crimson red. The garden beds I'd carefully cultivated with roses and lavender had been ripped out and replaced with modern geometric planters filled with stark white flowers. Even our mailbox had been changed from the charming wooden one we'd picked out together to some sleek black metal monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread, not on Maple Street in Portland, Oregon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Whitman, and I'm 71 years old. I've lived in the same beautiful Victorian house with my husband Robert for 43 years. We bought it when our son Daniel was just 3 years old, and I've spent decades turning it into our family home. Every room holds memories, every piece of furniture tells a story, and every corner reflects the love and care I've poured into making it ours. The hardwood floors showed the scuff marks from Daniel's childhood roller skates. The kitchen counters bear the gentle wear patterns from thousands of meals prepared with love. The living room walls display family photos spanning 4 decades, marking birthdays, graduations, holidays, and all the precious moments that make a house a home. Robert and I had been married for 46 years when we decided to take that trip to Ireland. It was meant to be a celebration of our life together, a chance to see the countryside where my grandmother had been born, and honestly, a much-needed break from the stress that had been building in our family over the past year. You see, our son Daniel had gotten married just 18 months earlier to a woman named Cassandra, and the adjustment period had been more challenging than any of us had anticipated. Daniel met Cassandra at an upscale interior design firm where she worked as a senior consultant. She was 34, 12 years younger than our 46-year-old son, and came from what she frequently reminded us was a very different background than ours. While Robert and I had built our comfortable middle-class life through hard work, saving, and making thoughtful choices over decades, Cassandra came from money. Real money. Her father owned a chain of luxury hotels, her mother had never worked outside the home, and Cassandra herself had grown up in houses that were featured in architectural magazines. From the very beginning, I could see that our modest but beloved home didn't meet Cassandra's standards. During their engagement, she would make little comments about how certain rooms felt outdated, how the color schemes weren't quite right for modern tastes, how some of our furniture pieces could be upgraded to better reflect current trends. I tried to take these comments in stride, understanding that she worked in design and naturally noticed these things more than most people would. After all, I told myself, she was going to be family, and families sometimes see things differently. The wedding itself had been a lavish affair that cost more than Robert and I had spent on our entire first year of marriage. Cassandra's parents had insisted on paying for everything, which was generous, but it also meant that every detail reflected their taste, rather than any input from Daniel or our family. I remember feeling somewhat out of place at my own son's wedding, surrounded by elaborate floral arrangements and design choices that felt completely foreign to everything I associated with celebration and joy. After the honeymoon, Daniel and Cassandra moved into a stunning contemporary apartment downtown that Cassandra had furnished with pieces that cost more than most people's cars. When they would visit us for Sunday dinners, I noticed how Cassandra would look around our home with what I can only describe as barely concealed distress. She would compliment specific items in ways that felt backhanded, saying how charming it was that we'd kept the original fixtures, or how interesting it was to see authentic vintage pieces still in use. But I genuinely tried to build a relationship with my new daughter-in-law. I invited her to go shopping with me, thinking we might bond over picking out things for their new apartment. I suggested we take cooking classes together, hoping we could find common ground in creating meals for Daniel. I even offered to show her some of my favorite antique shops and local artisan markets, thinking she might appreciate the craftsmanship and history behind unique pieces. Every attempt I made seemed to fall flat. Cassandra would agree to these outings, but then spend the entire time subtly criticizing my choices or explaining how things could be done better, more efficiently, or with more sophisticated taste. When I showed her a beautiful handmade quilt at one of my favorite shops, she mentioned how machine-made textiles had much more consistent quality control. When I pointed out a gorgeous restored Victorian writing desk, she talked about how modern ergonomic furniture was so much better for your posture and productivity. The tension came to a head about 6 months after their wedding during one of our regular Sunday dinners. We were sitting in our dining room, the same room where we'd celebrated Daniel's high school graduation, his college acceptance, and countless other family milestones, when Cassandra made a comment that stopped the conversation cold. She was looking around the room with that expression I'd grown to recognize, the one that suggested she was mentally cataloging everything that didn't meet her standards, when she said, "You know, Margaret, this house has such good bones. The architecture is actually quite solid for something built in the 1920s. With the right updates and some professional guidance, it could really be transformed into something special." The implication was clear. Our home as it currently existed was not something special. The life we'd built, the memories we'd created, the careful choices we'd made over decades to create a warm and welcoming environment for our family, all of that was just raw material waiting for her professional touch to make it worthy. Robert, who had been quietly eating his pot roast, looked up and said mildly, "We've always thought it was pretty special just as it is," but I could see the hurt in his eyes. This was the home where he'd taught Daniel to ride a bicycle in the hallway during winter months. This was where he'd built the beautiful built-in bookshelves that held our collection of family favorites. This was where we'd hosted Daniel's friends for countless sleepovers and birthday parties, where we'd welcomed neighbors during difficult times, where we'd created a lifetime of warmth and hospitality. Daniel, caught between his mother and his wife, tried to smooth things over by saying something about how everyone has different tastes and how much he loved both his childhood home and his new apartment. But I could see that Cassandra's comments had planted seeds of doubt in his mind, too. For the first time, I watched my son look around the dining room where he'd grown up and see it through his wife's critical eyes rather than through the lens of love and memory. That night, after they'd gone home, Robert and I had one of the most difficult conversations of our marriage. We talked about whether we were being too sensitive, whether Cassandra's suggestions came from a place of genuine caring, whether we should consider making some updates to help her feel more comfortable in our home. We even discussed whether we were somehow failing as in-laws by not being more open to her input and expertise. But deep down, I knew that this wasn't about paint colors or furniture styles. This was about respect. This was about understanding that a home isn't just a collection of objects arranged in rooms, but a reflection of the people who live there, the life they've built together, and the values they hold dear. Our home told the story of our family, and Cassandra seemed determined to erase that story and replace it with something that would look good in a magazine but would have no connection to who we actually were. Over the following months, the situation continued to deteriorate in small but significant ways. Cassandra would bring Daniel by to pick up something or drop something off, and she would make casual observations about how a particular room could benefit from different window treatments, or how the layout might work better with the furniture arranged differently, or how certain color combinations were becoming quite dated in contemporary design. She started bringing Daniel magazines featuring homes that looked nothing like ours, pointing out design elements that she thought were particularly striking or innovative. She would leave these magazines on our coffee table after their visits, open to pages showcasing stark, minimalist spaces or ultra-modern rooms that felt more like art installations than places where people actually lived their daily lives. The worst part was watching how these constant suggestions were affecting Daniel. My son, who had always loved coming home, who had always felt comfortable and relaxed in the house where he'd grown up, started to seem restless and dissatisfied during his visits. He would walk through rooms he'd known his entire life as if he was seeing them for the first time, and not necessarily in a good way. One evening in late fall, about a year after their wedding, Daniel called to ask if he could come by alone to talk. When he arrived, he seemed nervous and uncomfortable, which immediately put me on edge. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd helped him with homework every night throughout elementary school, where we'd had countless heart-to-heart conversations during his teenage years, where he'd told me about meeting Cassandra and asked for my blessing before he proposed. He started by saying how much he loved Robert and me, how grateful he was for everything we'd done for him throughout his life, and how he hoped we could have an honest conversation about something that had been on his mind. My heart sank because I had a feeling I knew what was coming. Daniel explained that Cassandra had been feeling somewhat uncomfortable in our house, not because she didn't want to spend time with us, but because she felt like she couldn't fully relax in an environment that felt so different from what she was used to. She said that with her background in design, she couldn't help but notice things that could be improved, and that it was actually causing her some stress to spend time in spaces that felt outdated or poorly arranged from a professional perspective. Then came the request that changed everything between us. Daniel asked if we would consider letting Cassandra help us update some areas of the house. Nothing major, he assured me. Just some paint colors, maybe some new furniture arrangements, perhaps some modern touches that would make the space feel more current and welcoming. He emphasized that this would be Cassandra's gift to us, that she wouldn't charge us anything for her professional services, and that she really wanted to do this as a way of showing her love and appreciation for her new family. I remember sitting there in my kitchen, looking at my son's earnest face and feeling a mixture of sadness, frustration, and something that might have been panic. This was the kitchen where I'd baked his birthday cakes every year, where I'd packed his school lunches, where Robert and I had painted the cabinets together during one memorable weekend when Daniel was away at summer camp. Every scratch on the wooden table, every worn spot on the floor, every carefully chosen decorative touch represented decades of our family's life together. But Daniel was my only child, and I could see how much this meant to him. I could see that saying no would create problems in his marriage, and I didn't want to be the mother-in-law who caused friction between my son and his wife. So, against every instinct I had, against the voice in my head that was screaming that this was a terrible idea, I told Daniel that Robert and I would think about it. That night, I talked to Robert about Daniel's request. My husband, who had always been the more diplomatic of the two of us, pointed out that maybe this could be an opportunity to build a better relationship with Cassandra. Maybe if we let her help with some small updates, she would feel more included in our family, more comfortable in our home, and more invested in maintaining a good relationship with us. We even discussed whether we were somehow failing as in-laws by not being more open to her input and expertise.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
But deep down, I knew that this wasn't about paint colors or furniture styles. This was about respect. This was about understanding that a home isn't just a collection of objects arranged in rooms, but a reflection of the people who live there, the life they've built together, and the values they hold dear. Our home told the story of our family, and Cassandra seemed determined to erase that story and replace it with something that would look good in a magazine but would have no connection to who we actually were. Over the following months, the situation continued to deteriorate in small but significant ways. Cassandra would bring Daniel by to pick up something or drop something off, and she would make casual observations about how a particular room could benefit from different window treatments, or how the layout might work better with the furniture arranged differently, or how certain color combinations were becoming quite dated in contemporary design. She started bringing Daniel magazines featuring homes that looked nothing like ours, pointing out design elements that she thought were particularly striking or innovative. She would leave these magazines on our coffee table after their visits, open to pages showcasing stark, minimalist spaces or ultra-modern rooms that felt more like art installations than places where people actually lived their daily lives. The worst part was watching how these constant suggestions were affecting Daniel. My son, who had always loved coming home, who had always felt comfortable and relaxed in the house where he'd grown up, started to seem restless and dissatisfied during his visits. He would walk through rooms he'd known his entire life, as if he was seeing them for the first time, and not necessarily in a good way. One evening in late fall, about a year after their wedding, Daniel called to ask if he could come by alone to talk. When he arrived, he seemed nervous and uncomfortable, which immediately put me on edge. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd helped him with homework every night throughout elementary school, where we'd had countless heart-to-heart conversations during his teenage years, where he'd told me about meeting Cassandra and asked for my blessing before he proposed. He started by saying how much he loved Robert and me, how grateful he was for everything we'd done for him throughout his life, and how he hoped we could have an honest conversation about something that had been on his mind. My heart sank because I had a feeling I knew what was coming. Daniel explained that Cassandra had been feeling somewhat uncomfortable in our house, not because she didn't want to spend time with us, but because she felt like she couldn't fully relax in an environment that felt so different from what she was used to. He said she'd mentioned that with her background in design, she couldn't help but notice things that could be improved, and that it was actually causing her some stress to spend time in spaces that felt outdated or poorly arranged from a professional perspective. Then came the request that changed everything between us. Daniel asked if we would consider letting Cassandra help us update some areas of the house. Nothing major, he assured me, just some paint colors, maybe some new furniture arrangements, perhaps some modern touches that would make the space feel more current and welcoming. He emphasized that this would be Cassandra's gift to us, that she wouldn't charge us anything for her professional services, and that she really wanted to do this as a way of showing her love and appreciation for her new family. I remember sitting there in my kitchen, looking at my son's earnest face and feeling a mixture of sadness, frustration, and something that might have been panic. This was the kitchen where I'd baked his birthday cakes every year, where I'd packed his school lunches, where Robert and I had painted the cabinets together during one memorable weekend when Daniel was away at summer camp. Every scratch on the wooden table, every worn spot on the floor, every carefully chosen decorative touch represented decades of our family's life together. But Daniel was my only child, and I could see how much this meant to him. I could see that saying no would create problems in his marriage, and I didn't want to be the mother-in-law who caused friction between my son and his wife. So, against every instinct I had, against the voice in my head that was screaming that this was a terrible idea, I told Daniel that Robert and I would think about it. That night, I talked to Robert about Daniel's request. My husband, who had always been the more diplomatic of the two of us, pointed out that maybe this could be an opportunity to build a better relationship with Cassandra. Maybe if we let her help with some small updates, she would feel more included in our family, more comfortable in our home, and more invested in maintaining a good relationship with us. He suggested that we could set some boundaries, perhaps limiting the changes to 1 or 2 rooms and maintaining veto power over anything we really didn't like. Looking back now, I can see that we were both trying to convince ourselves that this could work, that we could find a compromise that would make everyone happy. We were both so focused on preserving family harmony that we didn't fully consider what we might be sacrificing in the process. We didn't think about the fact that once we opened the door to changes, it might be very difficult to control how far those changes would go. After several days of discussion and deliberation, Robert and I decided to tell Daniel that we would be open to letting Cassandra help us with some minor updates to the guest bedroom and maybe the powder room downstairs. These seemed like safe choices, rooms that didn't hold as many deep personal memories, spaces that we could potentially change without feeling like we were losing essential parts of our family's history. When Daniel called to tell Cassandra about our decision, I could hear her excitement through the phone. She immediately started talking about color palettes and furniture styles, about how she could create spaces that would feel both timeless and contemporary, about how much she was looking forward to working on this project with us. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that this really could be a positive experience that would bring us closer together as a family. We arranged to meet the following weekend so that Cassandra could take measurements and photos of the 2 rooms we'd agreed to let her work on. She arrived with a professional-looking portfolio, measuring tape, and a camera, looking every inch the successful designer she was. She spent nearly an hour in each room, taking notes, sketching ideas, and asking us questions about our preferences and lifestyle needs. I was impressed by how thorough and professional she was, how she seemed to genuinely listen to our answers about what we liked and didn't like, how we used the spaces, and what kinds of changes we might find most appealing. She talked about creating designs that would honor the home's original character while incorporating modern conveniences and aesthetics. She promised to show us everything before making any major purchases or changes, assuring us that this would be a collaborative process every step of the way. For the first time since she joined our family, I felt like Cassandra and I might actually be able to work together successfully. I started to think that maybe Robert had been right, that this could be an opportunity to build a better relationship with my daughter-in-law while also getting some updates that might make our home more comfortable and functional. Over the next few weeks, Cassandra presented us with detailed plans for both rooms. The designs were beautiful, sophisticated, and much more elaborate than what Robert and I had been envisioning. But she explained everything so clearly and seemed so confident that we found ourselves agreeing to changes that went well beyond what we'd originally discussed. For the guest bedroom, instead of just updating the paint color and maybe getting a new bedspread, we were now looking at new flooring, completely different furniture, custom window treatments, and a whole new lighting scheme. The powder room project had similarly expanded to include new fixtures, tile work, a completely different vanity, and decorative elements that would coordinate with what she was calling the home's new design direction. When I asked about the cost of all these changes, Cassandra waved away my concerns, explaining that she had relationships with suppliers and contractors that would allow her to get everything at significant discounts. She said that her wedding gift to us was not just her design services, but also her ability to source everything at near wholesale prices. The total cost, she assured us, would be much less than if we hired another designer and paid retail prices for everything. Robert and I discussed the expanded scope of the project and decided that since Cassandra was being so generous with her time and her professional connections, we could afford to let her do more than we'd originally planned. We agreed to move forward with her designs for both rooms with the understanding that she would check with us before making any major purchases and that we would have final approval on everything before installation. I should have recognized the warning signs when Cassandra's timeline kept changing. First, she said the projects would take about 4 weeks. Then it became 6 weeks. Then she mentioned that some of the materials she'd ordered had been delayed and that the contractors she'd hired had other commitments that might push our timeline back even further. But she was always so apologetic about the delays, always so confident that the final results would be worth the wait, that Robert and I didn't think too much about it. What we didn't realize was that during the same time period, Cassandra was also making plans for what she apparently saw as the next phase of our home's transformation. She had taken photos and measurements of other rooms during her initial visit, and she had been developing designs for areas of the house that we had never agreed to let her change. The guest bedroom and powder room projects were completed in early spring, about 3 months after we'd first agreed to let Cassandra help us with some updates. I have to admit, both rooms looked absolutely stunning. They were sophisticated, beautifully coordinated, and completely different from anything Robert and I would have chosen for ourselves. The quality of everything was impeccable, from the custom-made curtains to the imported tile in the powder room to the antique-style fixtures that somehow managed to look both historic and contemporary. But even as I admired the professional results of Cassandra's work, I felt a strange sense of loss. These rooms no longer felt like they belonged to us. They were beautiful, but they were beautiful in the way that hotel rooms or designer showrooms are beautiful, perfectly appointed but somehow impersonal. When friends came over and complimented the changes, I found myself saying thank you, but feeling like I was taking credit for something that had nothing to do with my own taste or personality. Cassandra, meanwhile, was clearly thrilled with how everything had turned out. She took professional quality photos of both rooms and posted them on her social media accounts as examples of her work. She brought colleagues from her design firm to see the results, and I overheard her telling them about her vision for the rest of the house, about how these 2 rooms were just the beginning of a complete transformation that would turn our traditional family home into something worthy of a magazine feature. That's when I realized that we had very different understandings of what had happened. Robert and I thought we had completed a project, that we had let our daughter-in-law help us update 2 rooms as a way of building family connections and improving our home in a limited way.
Cassandra clearly saw what we'd done as the first phase of a much larger plan that she was expecting to continue. The tension came to a head about a month after the two rooms were finished. Daniel and Cassandra came over for Sunday dinner, and afterward, Cassandra started talking about her ideas for the living room. She had sketches with her, detailed plans for new furniture arrangements, paint colors, and decorative elements that would coordinate with the work she had already done in the guest bedroom and powder room. When I gently mentioned that Robert and I were happy with our living room as it was, that we hadn't discussed making any changes beyond the two rooms we had already completed, Cassandra looked genuinely surprised.
She explained that she'd assumed we'd want to continue with the transformation, that leaving just two rooms updated while the rest of the house remained unchanged would create an inconsistent design aesthetic that would actually make both the old and new areas look worse. She talked about the importance of having a cohesive design vision throughout a home, about how professional designers always think in terms of whole house concepts rather than isolated room updates. She said that stopping now would be like painting only part of a wall, that it would leave our home feeling disjointed and unfinished in a way that would bother anyone with trained design sensibilities. Daniel supported his wife's perspective, saying that he'd been thinking the same thing, that the updated rooms made the rest of the house look dated by comparison. He suggested that since the first project had gone so well, and since Cassandra was willing to continue donating her professional services, it would make sense to let her help us bring the same level of sophistication to other areas of our home. I tried to explain that Robert and I were perfectly happy with the rest of our house, that we appreciated the work Cassandra had done, but didn't feel the need to change everything else to match it. I mentioned that we had limited budget for more renovations, and that we valued the character and history of our home as it was. But I could see that both Daniel and Cassandra viewed my reluctance as unreasonable, maybe even ungrateful. They saw beautiful, professionally designed rooms that could serve as the foundation for an even more beautiful home, and they couldn't understand why I wouldn't want to continue with what they saw as an obviously beneficial process. That conversation ended without any resolution, but I could tell that the issue wasn't going to go away. Over the following weeks, Cassandra continued to bring up her ideas for other rooms, always framing her suggestions in terms of how they would improve our quality of life, increase our home's value, and create a more welcoming environment for entertaining and family gatherings. She started pointing out specific things that she felt needed attention. The hardwood floors in the living room could benefit from refinishing and a different stain color. The built-in bookshelves that Robert had constructed with such pride were beautiful craftsmanship, but they would look much more sophisticated painted in a modern neutral color rather than the natural wood finish we'd always loved. The family photos covering one wall of the hallway created visual clutter that made the space feel cramped and dated. Each comment felt like a small criticism of our choices, our taste, our life. I started to feel self-conscious in my own home, noticing things that had never bothered me before, wondering if other people saw our house the way Cassandra did. I found myself apologizing to guests for the outdated decor or making excuses for why certain rooms didn't match the updated ones. The situation became even more stressful when Cassandra started bringing design magazines and catalogs to our Sunday dinners, eager to share ideas for what she called Phase 2 of our home's transformation. She would spread these materials out on our dining room table, pointing out elements that would work beautifully in our space, explaining how certain changes would create better flow between rooms, how specific color schemes would make areas feel larger and more inviting. Robert and I tried to remain polite and appreciative while also being clear about our boundaries, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. We felt pressured to continue with changes we didn't want, guilty for not appreciating Cassandra's generosity and expertise, and sad about the growing tension that was affecting our relationship with Daniel and our enjoyment of time spent in our own home. Finally, in late spring, Robert and I made the decision to take our anniversary trip to Ireland. We'd been talking about this trip for years, ever since I'd started researching my grandmother's family history and discovered the specific village where she'd been born. The timing felt right for multiple reasons. We wanted to celebrate our 46 years of marriage, we needed some distance from the ongoing stress about our home renovations, and we thought that a few weeks away might give everyone some perspective on the situation. We arranged for our neighbor to check on the house while we were gone, and we asked Daniel to stop by periodically to make sure everything was secure. We deliberately didn't give Cassandra a key, though we did tell Daniel where we kept the spare key hidden outside in case of emergencies. Looking back, I realized this was the mistake that made everything possible. But at the time, it seemed like a reasonable arrangement. The trip to Ireland was everything we'd hoped it would be. We spent 2 weeks driving through the countryside, visiting historical sites, staying in charming bed and breakfast establishments, and ultimately finding the small village where my grandmother had spent her childhood. We met distant relatives who had never left Ireland, saw the stone cottage where my great-grandparents had raised their family, and walked through the same countryside that my grandmother had described in stories throughout my childhood. For 2 weeks, Robert and I rediscovered what it felt like to be completely relaxed, to enjoy each other's company without the underlying stress that had been affecting our home life for months. We talked about our hopes for our relationship with Daniel and Cassandra, about ways we might be able to find better balance between being welcoming to our daughter-in-law and maintaining our own autonomy in our own home. We decided that when we returned from Ireland, we would have a clear, kind conversation with both of them about our appreciation for what Cassandra had already done and our contentment with our home as it currently was. We planned to emphasize that our reluctance to continue with more changes wasn't a rejection of Cassandra's talents or generosity, but simply a reflection of our own preferences and comfort with our living space. We're feeling hopeful and optimistic about resolving the ongoing tension as our plane touched down at Portland International Airport. We'd had a wonderful trip, we'd gained perspective on our situation at home, and we were looking forward to sharing our travel experiences with Daniel and Cassandra while also having that important conversation about boundaries and expectations. Nothing could have prepared us for what we discovered when we pulled into our own driveway. The sight that greeted us as we drove up Maple Street toward our home was so shocking, so completely incomprehensible, that for a moment I wondered if we had made a wrong turn somewhere. But no, there was Mrs. Henderson's blue mailbox next door, there was the old oak tree we'd planted when Daniel graduated high school, and there was our house number clearly visible on what used to be our charming wooden mailbox, but was now some kind of sleek black metal sculpture that looked like it belonged in front of a minimalist art gallery. The front door that had been sage green for 15 years was now painted an aggressive crimson red that seemed to scream for attention against the soft gray siding we'd always loved. The wraparound porch that had been our pride and joy, furnished with the white wicker chairs where Robert and I had spent countless summer evenings reading and watching neighbors walk by with their dogs, now featured stark black furniture that looked like it belonged on the terrace of an expensive downtown restaurant. My beloved rose garden, where I had spent decades cultivating heirloom varieties passed down from my mother and grandmother, had been completely destroyed. In its place were geometric concrete planters filled with what appeared to be ornamental grasses and white flowers arranged in precise, unnatural-looking patterns. The meandering stone pathway I'd laid myself, following the natural curves of the landscape and bordered with lamb's ear and lavender, had been replaced with straight lines of modern pavers that created harsh angles across what had been my peaceful front garden.
Even the windows looked different.
The soft cream-colored curtains I'd sewn myself, which had provided privacy while still letting in natural light and allowing us to wave to neighbors, had been replaced with stark white panels that blocked any view into or out of our home. Our house, which had always felt warm and welcoming, now looked cold and forbidding, like a structure designed to keep people out rather than invite them in. Robert and I sat in our rental car in our own driveway, staring at the transformed exterior of our home in complete silence. I felt as though I was having some kind of breakdown, as though my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. This couldn't be our house. This couldn't be the home where we'd raised our son, where we'd hosted neighborhood barbecues, where we'd welcomed friends and family for holiday celebrations for more than 4 decades. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, what has she done to our house?" I couldn't answer him because I didn't have words for what I was feeling. Betrayal didn't begin to cover it. Violation felt closer, but even that seemed inadequate. This was our home, our sanctuary, our most personal and private space, and someone had fundamentally altered it without our knowledge or consent while we were away. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone to call Daniel. The call went straight to voicemail, which only increased my panic. I tried calling again, and again it went to voicemail. Robert suggested we go inside to assess the full extent of whatever had happened, but I found myself reluctant to leave the car. As long as we stayed outside, I could tell myself that maybe the changes were limited to the exterior, that perhaps the inside of our home was still intact. But we couldn't sit in the driveway forever. Robert got out of the car and came around to open my door, helping me to my feet with the same gentle care he'd shown throughout our marriage. Together, we walked up the new harsh pathway toward the front door that no longer looked like it belonged to us. I reached for my house keys, but when I inserted them into the lock, it wouldn't turn. She'd even changed our locks. Standing there on my own front porch, unable to get into my own home, I felt a level of helplessness and disorientation that I'd never experienced before. This was the house where I'd brought my newborn son home from the hospital, where I'd nursed him through childhood illnesses, where I'd celebrated his achievements and comforted him through disappointments. This was the place where Robert and I had built our life together, and now I couldn't even get inside. Robert went to check under the decorative stone where we'd always kept a spare key, but that was gone too. In desperation, I called Daniel again, and this time he answered on the first ring. His voice sounded strangely cheerful, almost excited as he said hello. "Daniel, we're home from Ireland and we can't get into our house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The locks have been changed and the whole front of the house looks completely different. What happened while we were away?" There was a pause, and then Daniel said, "Oh, right, I should have called you about the locks. Cassandra changed them for security reasons during the renovation. She has the new keys, and she's at the house right now putting some finishing touches on everything. She wanted to surprise you with how amazing everything looks." Surprise. The word echoed in my head as I looked around at the unrecognizable exterior of my home. This wasn't a surprise. It was an ambush. This wasn't a gift. It was a hostile takeover. But I couldn't say any of that to my son, who clearly thought that what had happened was something wonderful that Robert and I should be grateful for. "Daniel, we never agreed to any renovation beyond those 2 rooms," I said, fighting to keep my voice calm. "We specifically discussed not making changes to the rest of the house. How could this have happened without our permission?" "Mom, Cassandra really wanted to do something special for you while you were away," Daniel replied, and I could hear the defensive tone creeping into his voice. "She worked so hard on this, and she used her own money for a lot of the materials because she wanted it to be a gift. She's been putting in 12-hour days for the past 2 weeks to get everything finished before you got home." "I thought you'd be thrilled." Before I could respond, the front door opened, and Cassandra appeared, wearing work clothes and a bright smile that faltered when she saw the expressions on our faces. She was holding a ring of keys that I assumed were the new keys to our own home, and she looked genuinely confused by our obvious distress. "Margaret, Robert, welcome home," she said with enthusiasm that felt surreal given the circumstances. "I know this must be a shock, but wait until you see what we've accomplished. The whole house flows so much better now, and everything coordinates beautifully. It's like something out of a design magazine." She held out the keys toward me, but I found myself unable to take them. The simple act of accepting those keys felt like acknowledging that what she had done was acceptable, that she had the right to change our locks and renovate our home without our consent, that we should be grateful for this violation of our most basic boundaries. "Cassandra," I said slowly, "we need to talk about what happened here. We never agreed to changes beyond the guest bedroom and powder room. We specifically discussed not wanting to renovate other areas of the house." "I know," she said, still smiling. "But once I started working on those rooms, I could see so clearly how the whole house could be transformed. The potential was just incredible. And I knew that once you saw the finished result, you'd understand why I had to keep going. This house deserves to be a showcase, and now it finally is." She gestured toward the front door, clearly expecting us to follow her inside to see what she'd accomplished. "Come on, let me give you the grand tour. I've been working 18-hour days to get everything perfect before you got back. Wait until you see the kitchen. It's absolutely stunning now." My kitchen. She had renovated my kitchen, the heart of our home, the room where I'd prepared thousands of meals for my family, where Daniel had done his homework every night throughout school, where Robert and I had our morning coffee together every single day for decades. Without my knowledge or consent, she had changed the space that was most personal and meaningful to me. Robert took my arm to steady me as we followed Cassandra into our own home. The moment we stepped inside, I felt like Alice falling down the rabbit hole into some alternate reality where everything familiar had been replaced by something that looked expensive and sophisticated, but felt completely alien. The warm hardwood floors that had shown the gentle wear patterns of our family's daily life had been refinished in a dark, glossy stain that made them look formal and cold. The walls that had been painted in the soft, welcoming colors Robert and I had chosen together over the years were now uniformly painted in various shades of gray and white that created a monochromatic palette throughout the entire house. All of our furniture was gone, every single piece. The comfortable sofa where our family had watched movies together, where I'd nursed Daniel when he was sick, where Robert and I had cuddled while reading Sunday morning newspapers for decades, had been replaced by a sleek, modern sectional in charcoal gray that looked like something from a high-end furniture showroom. The built-in bookshelves that Robert had constructed with such pride and care, stained to match the original woodwork of the house, had been painted stark white. Our books, collected over a lifetime of shared interests and individual passions, had been removed and replaced with decorative objects arranged in precise, aesthetically pleasing configurations that had nothing to do with our personalities or interests. But the most devastating change was the complete removal of all our family photographs, decades of memories that had covered our walls, marking birthdays and holidays and graduations and anniversaries, documenting the growth of our family and the evolution of our relationships, had simply vanished. In their place were abstract art prints that looked like they'd been purchased as a matching set from some upscale home goods store. Cassandra was walking through the rooms with obvious pride, pointing out specific design elements and explaining her choices as though she were giving a professional presentation to potential clients. She talked about color palettes and sightlines, about how she'd created better flow between spaces, about how the new furniture arrangement maximized both function and visual impact. "And wait until you see the kitchen," she said, practically glowing with excitement. "That was the most challenging space, but I think it's the most successful transformation in the whole house." She led us into what had been my kitchen, and I felt my legs give out slightly.
Robert caught me and helped me to one of the new bar stools that had replaced the kitchen table where our family had shared meals for decades. This room, which had been the warm heart of our home, had been gutted and transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a luxury condominium designed for people who never actually cooked. The warm wooden cabinets that Robert and I had saved for months to purchase, that we'd carefully selected for their quality and craftsmanship, had been replaced with sleek white cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. The cozy breakfast nook where Daniel had eaten his cereal every morning before school, where Robert and I had lingered over coffee and planned our days, had been eliminated to make room for an oversized kitchen island, topped with some kind of expensive-looking stone. All of my small appliances, collected over years and chosen for their functionality and the memories attached to them, had been replaced with matching stainless steel versions that looked impressive but had no connection to how I actually cooked or what I actually needed.
Even my dish towels, pot holders, and other personal touches that had made the kitchen feel like mine had been replaced with coordinated accessories that looked like they'd been purchased from a catalog. "Isn't it incredible?" Cassandra asked, clearly expecting praise and appreciation. "The sight lines from the kitchen to the living room are so much better now, and the new island provides so much more storage and workspace. This kitchen can handle serious entertaining now." I looked around the room where I'd baked Daniel's birthday cakes every year, where I'd canned vegetables from our garden every summer, where I'd prepared comfort food during times of illness or stress, where I'd had countless conversations with friends and family members who had felt comfortable enough to sit at my kitchen table and share their joys and concerns. All evidence of that life, all traces of those memories, had been erased and replaced with something that looked like a photograph from a home design magazine. "Where are our things?" I finally managed to ask. "Where is our furniture, our dishes, our photographs, everything that was in this house?" "Oh, I donated most of the furniture to charity," Cassandra said casually. "It was all so outdated and worn, and none of it worked with the new design aesthetic. I did save some of the family photos, though. They're packed away in boxes in the basement. I thought you might want to choose a few special ones to display in the new frames I picked out." She had donated our furniture to charity. Decades of carefully chosen pieces, items that held memories and meaning. Furniture that was still perfectly functional and comfortable had been disposed of as though it were junk. She had packed away our family photographs, the visual record of our life together, as though they were outdated decorations that could be replaced with more stylish alternatives. "The dishes and cookware were mostly in pretty rough shape," she continued, "so I replaced all of that too. The new dinnerware is so much more elegant, and it coordinates perfectly with the kitchen's color scheme. You're going to love entertaining with the new pieces." My grandmother's china, which had been passed down through 3 generations and used for every special occasion in our family, was apparently now considered to be in rough shape. The cast iron cookware that had seasoned perfectly over decades of use, that had cooked thousands of meals with the kind of even heat distribution that modern pans couldn't match, had been replaced with matching sets that looked impressive but had no history or character. Robert, who had been silent throughout this tour of our transformed home, finally spoke up. "Cassandra, where did you get the authority to make these changes? We specifically told Daniel that we didn't want renovations beyond those 2 rooms." "Well," she said, looking slightly less confident for the first time since we'd arrived, "Daniel gave me permission to go ahead with the project. He said that once you saw the results, you'd understand why it needed to be done. This house has such good bones, but it was being wasted with all that outdated decor and furniture. Now it finally lives up to its potential." She turned to me with renewed enthusiasm. "Margaret, I know this is a lot to take in all at once, but I really think once you live with the changes for a few days, you'll see how much better everything functions. The flow is so much improved, the stored solutions are far more efficient, and the overall aesthetic is so much more sophisticated than what you had before." What we had before. As though our life, our choices, our personal style, our family history were problems that needed to be solved rather than the foundation of a home that reflected who we were and what we valued. I looked around the kitchen that no longer felt like mine, thought about the bedroom where we'd have to sleep, surrounded by unfamiliar furniture, imagined trying to cook meals with appliances I'd never chosen and didn't know how to use. "I need to sit down," I said quietly, but there was nowhere to sit in this new kitchen except for the uncomfortable-looking bar stools at the oversized island. The cozy kitchen table where I'd sat for morning coffee every day for decades was gone, donated to charity, along with everything else that had made this house feel like home. Cassandra must have sensed that her grand revelation wasn't going as well as she had planned, because her tone became more defensive. "I put so much thought into every detail," she said. "I researched the architectural history of houses from this era. I studied current design trends that would honor the original structure while updating it for contemporary living. I worked with suppliers to get the best quality materials at the best prices. This renovation would have cost you at least $60,000 if you'd hired another designer. But I did it all as a gift because I love this family." $60,000. She had spent $60,000 renovating our home without our knowledge or consent, making changes we had explicitly said we didn't want, disposing of our belongings and replacing them with things that reflected her taste rather than ours. And she expected us to be grateful because she had done it as a gift. "Daniel knew about all of this?" Robert asked, his voice carefully controlled, but with an edge I recognized as barely contained anger.
Of course, Cassandra replied. He was here almost every day, helping with decisions and coordinating with the contractors. He was so excited about surprising you with the transformation. He kept saying how thrilled you'd be to come home to such a beautiful, updated house. My son had watched while his wife dismantled the home where he'd grown up, disposing of furniture he'd known his entire life, packing away family photographs that documented his own childhood, allowing the kitchen where his mother had lovingly prepared his meals for decades to be gutted and replaced with something that bore no resemblance to the warm, welcoming space where he'd been nurtured and cared for. And he thought we'd be thrilled. "I need some air," I said, walking toward the front door before anyone could respond. Robert followed me outside, and we stood together on the front porch that no longer felt like ours, looking out at the neighborhood where we'd lived for decades, but now feeling like strangers in our own lives. "What are we going to do?" Robert asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. Our home, our sanctuary, our most personal and private space had been completely transformed without our consent. Our belongings had been disposed of or packed away. Our son and daughter-in-law clearly believed that what they'd done was a wonderful gift that we should appreciate. And we were expected to be grateful for this violation of our most basic boundaries and autonomy. But as I stood there, looking at the unrecognizable exterior of our house, feeling the weight of everything that had been taken from us without our permission, I felt something shifting inside me. The shock and hurt were still there, but underneath those feelings, something else was growing. Something that felt like resolve, like determination, like the beginning of a plan. I had spent months trying to accommodate Cassandra's criticisms of our home. Months feeling apologetic about our choices and our lifestyle. Months wondering if maybe she was right that our house needed updating and our taste was outdated. But standing there in front of our transformed home, I realized that the problem had never been with our house or our choices. The problem was that we had allowed someone to convince us that our preferences didn't matter, that our comfort in our own home was less important than creating something that looked impressive to outsiders, that our decades of life and love and memories could be improved upon by someone who valued aesthetics over meaning. That realization sparked something in me that had been dormant for too long. For months, I'd been trying to be the accommodating mother-in-law, the gracious woman who didn't make waves, who prioritized family harmony over her own needs and preferences. But looking at what that approach had cost us, I understood that sometimes being accommodating isn't kind or generous. It's just enabling people to take advantage of your good nature. "Robert," I said slowly, "I think it's time we reminded some people that this is our house, our life, and our choice about how we want to live.
He looked at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "What are you thinking, Margaret?" "I'm thinking," I said, feeling more certain with each word, "that if Cassandra can redecorate our entire house without asking our permission, then I can redecorate her attitude without asking her permission either." The first thing I did was call a locksmith. Within 2 hours, a cheerful gentleman named Tom arrived and changed all the locks on our house back to ones that Robert and I controlled. While he worked, I made a list of every single change that had been made to our home without our permission, photographing everything with my phone for documentation purposes. I also called our insurance company to report the unauthorized renovation and ask about coverage for restoration costs. That evening, when Daniel and Cassandra arrived for what they clearly expected to be a celebration dinner in our transformed home, they found that they couldn't get in. I watched from the living room window as they stood on the front porch, trying their keys in the new locks, looking increasingly confused and agitated. When they finally rang the doorbell, I took my time answering it. "Mom, what's going on?" Daniel asked immediately. "Our keys don't work." "That's correct," I replied calmly. "I had the locks changed back. This is my house, and I decide who has access to it." "But we live here too when we visit," Cassandra said, her voice rising with indignation. "I put so much work into making this place beautiful for all of us." "You don't live here," I corrected her firmly. "You have your own home, and you made these changes without my permission, after I specifically told you that I didn't want renovations beyond those 2 rooms. I stepped aside to let them enter, but my body language made it clear that this was not the warm family gathering they'd been expecting. We sat in the living room, on furniture I didn't recognize, surrounded by decorative objects that had no meaning to me, and I felt like a stranger in my own home. "Cassandra," I began, my voice steady and controlled, "I want you to understand something very clearly. What you did while we were away was not a gift. It was a violation. You entered my home without permission and fundamentally altered it against my explicitly stated wishes. You disposed of my belongings, including family heirlooms that can never be replaced. You spent $60,000 of your own money on changes I never wanted, and now you expect me to be grateful for something that has caused me tremendous distress." "But look how beautiful everything is," she protested, gesturing around the room. "This house was so outdated and cluttered before. Now it's sophisticated and elegant. Any real estate agent would tell you that I've significantly increased your property value." "I don't care about property value. I care about living in a home that reflects who I am, not who you think I should be. I care about being surrounded by objects that have meaning in history, not by things that look good in photographs. I care about having my choices and preferences respected in my own home." Daniel, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mom, I think you're being unfair to Cassandra. She worked incredibly hard on this project. She used her own money and her professional expertise to create something amazing for you. Can't you at least try to appreciate the thought and effort that went into it?" "The thought?" I repeated, feeling my carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. "Daniel, the thought was that my home, as it was, wasn't good enough. The thought was that my taste, my choices, my way of living needed to be corrected by someone with superior knowledge and resources. The thought was that I was too stupid or too unsophisticated to know what was best for my own home." "That's not what I thought at all," Cassandra interjected. "I just wanted to help you create a more beautiful and functional living space." "Without asking me what I considered beautiful or functional," I pointed out, "without consulting me about my needs or preferences, without even informing me that you were planning to gut my entire house while I was away. You made decisions about my most personal space based entirely on your own taste and vision, with no regard for what I might want or how I might feel about losing everything that made this house feel like home to me." Robert, who had been quietly observing this conversation, finally spoke. "Cassandra, I think what Margaret is trying to explain is that you fundamentally violated our trust. We gave you permission to work on 2 rooms, and you used that as an excuse to renovate our entire house. We came home to find that our belongings had been disposed of, Our locks had been changed, and our home had been completely transformed without our knowledge or consent. From our perspective, this feels like a betrayal, not a gift. I can't believe you're both being so ungrateful, Cassandra said, her voice tight with frustration. Do you have any idea how much work I put into this? Do you know how many favors I called in to get quality contractors on short notice? Do you realize that I could have charged someone else $60,000 for this level of renovation, but I did it for free because I love this family? And that's part of the problem, I said quietly. You keep talking about this as though it were a generous gift, but gifts are things that the recipient wants and appreciates. If I gave you a makeover without your permission, completely changing your hair and your wardrobe and your makeup to reflect what I thought you should look like, would you consider that a gift, even if I spent thousands of dollars and worked very hard on it? She stared at me for a moment, clearly struggling to find a response that would maintain her position while addressing my analogy. That's completely different, she finally said. This is just interior design, not personal appearance. And your house really did need updating.
Anyone with design training could see that. So my personal space, the place where I live every day, where I cook and sleep and relax and entertain, is less important than my physical appearance, I asked. And the fact that you have design training gives you the right to override my preferences about how I want to live? The conversation continued in circles for nearly an hour, with Cassandra becoming increasingly defensive and Daniel trying to mediate between his wife and his mother. But I could see that neither of them really understood why Robert and I were so upset. They both seemed to believe that the professional quality and expensive cost of the renovation should override our concerns about consent and personal autonomy. Finally, I stood up and said, I think we need to end this conversation for tonight. Robert and I need time to process what's happened and decide how we want to move forward. What do you mean, move forward? Daniel asked, looking suddenly worried. I mean that your wife has created a situation that needs to be resolved, I replied. She has spent $60,000 renovating my home without my permission, and she has disposed of my belongings without my consent. There will be consequences for those actions, and I need time to determine what those consequences should be. After they left, Robert and I spent the evening walking through our transformed home, cataloging everything that had been changed and trying to identify what could be restored and what was permanently lost. The hardwood floors could potentially be refinished back to their original color, though it would be expensive. The walls could be repainted in the colors we preferred. Some of the furniture and decor could be replaced with items that better reflected our personal style. But some things were gone forever. My grandmother's china had been donated to charity and was irretrievable. The built-in bookshelves that Robert had crafted with such pride could be stripped and restained, but the process would likely damage the wood, and they would never look quite the same. The cozy breakfast nook in the kitchen had been eliminated entirely when the space was reconfigured, and restoring it would require major construction. More than the physical losses, though, was the emotional damage. I no longer felt comfortable or secure in my own home. Every room reminded me of this violation of our boundaries and trust. I couldn't cook in the kitchen without remembering that all my familiar tools and dishes were gone. I couldn't relax in the living room without seeing evidence of someone else's taste imposed on my personal space. That night, lying in our bedroom on a mattress we'd never chosen, surrounded by furniture that felt alien and unwelcoming, I realized that simply restoring the house to its original condition wouldn't be enough. The damage went deeper than paint colors and furniture choices. Cassandra had demonstrated that she didn't respect our autonomy, our preferences, or our boundaries, and she expected us to be grateful for her disrespect. Daniel had enabled and supported her actions, showing that he valued his wife's design vision more than his parents' comfort and consent. If we allowed this to pass without significant consequences, we would be teaching both of them that our feelings and preferences didn't matter, that they could override our decisions about our own lives as long as they spent enough money and claimed to be acting out of love. The next morning, I called my lawyer and scheduled an appointment to discuss our legal options. I also contacted a restoration contractor to get estimates for returning the house to its original condition. Then I sat down and wrote a detailed letter to Daniel and Cassandra outlining my expectations for how this situation would be resolved. When they arrived that evening, I handed them the letter and watched as they read it together. Their expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief to anger as they absorbed the contents. "You can't be serious about this," Cassandra said finally. "I am completely serious," I replied. "You have two choices. You can arrange to have this house restored to its original condition at your expense within 60 days. That includes refinishing the floors, repainting the walls, returning the kitchen to its original configuration, restoring the built-in shelving to its original stain, and replacing all the furniture and decor with items that match what was here before as closely as possible." "That would cost a fortune," Daniel protested. "Some of those changes can't even be undone." "Then you can choose the second option. You can purchase this house from us at fair market value, including the increased value from your renovations. And Robert and I will use that money to buy a different home that we can decorate according to our own preferences." "You're talking about selling the house where I grew up?"
Daniel asked, his voice rising with emotion. "I'm talking about living in a home where I feel comfortable and respected," I replied. "Right now, this house feels like a showcase for someone else's taste, rather than a home that reflects my life and choices. If you value Cassandra's design vision more than my comfort in my own home, then perhaps you should be the ones who get to live with it." Cassandra was staring at the letter with an expression I'd never seen before. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncertain, even frightened. "Margaret, you can't expect me to undo months of work and spend another $60,000 just because you don't appreciate good design." "I can and do expect exactly that," I said calmly. "You created this situation when you decided to renovate my home without my permission. You can resolve it by restoring what you destroyed, or you can buy the results of your unauthorized work. But I will not continue to live in a house that feels like a violation of my personal space and autonomy." "This is blackmail," she said angrily. "No," I corrected her. "This is consequences. Blackmail would be if I threatened to reveal some secret unless you paid me money. This is me telling you that your actions have created a problem, and now you need to fix that problem or compensate me for the losses you've caused." Daniel tried a different approach. "Mom, what if we compromise? What if Cassandra changes some things back but keeps the improvements that really do work better? Surely there are aspects of the renovation that you can appreciate." "Daniel," I said gently, "the issue isn't whether some of the changes are objectively improvements. The issue is that these changes were made without my consent, after I explicitly said I didn't want them. The issue is that Cassandra disposed of my belongings and spent $60,000 altering my home based entirely on her preferences rather than mine. Even if every single change were an improvement, the fact that they were imposed on me against my will makes them unacceptable." I looked at both of them steadily. For months, I've been trying to accommodate Cassandra's dissatisfaction with our home. I've listened to criticism of our decor, our furniture, our lifestyle choices, and I've tried to be understanding about her different background and training. But what happened while we were away wasn't about different tastes or constructive suggestions. It was about someone deciding that her vision for our home was more important than our own preferences and autonomy. "I was trying to do something wonderful for you," Cassandra said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had held in previous conversations. "Then you should have asked what I would consider wonderful," I replied. "You should have involved me in the planning, consulted me about the changes, respected my input about what I wanted and didn't want. Instead, you treated me like a client who was too unsophisticated to know what was best for her, and you proceeded based entirely on your own judgment." Robert, who had been quietly supportive throughout this conversation, added, "Cassandra, I think you need to understand that your professional expertise doesn't give you the right to override other people's personal choices. Margaret and I aren't your clients.
We're your family. And family relationships are supposed to be based on respect and consideration, not on one person imposing their will on others. The room fell silent as Daniel and Cassandra absorbed what we'd said. I could see them exchanging glances, probably trying to figure out whether we were bluffing, whether we'd really follow through on our ultimatum if they refused to comply with our demands. "We need time to think about this," Daniel finally said. "Of course," I agreed. "Take all the time you need. But I want you to understand that I'm not negotiating about this. Those are your two options, and you have 60 days to choose one of them. If you haven't started making arrangements by then, Robert and I will put the house on the market and move somewhere that feels like home to us." After they left, Robert and I sat in our unfamiliar living room and talked about whether we'd handled the situation appropriately. Part of me wondered if we were being too harsh, if we should be more forgiving of what Cassandra clearly viewed as a generous gesture, even if it had been misguided. But then I thought about all the months I'd spent feeling uncomfortable in my own home, apologizing to guests for decor that I'd actually loved, second-guessing choices that had reflected decades of thoughtful decisions by Robert and I. I thought about how violated I felt walking through our transformed house, seeing our personal belongings replaced by generic items chosen by someone who valued aesthetics over meaning. Most importantly, I thought about what message we would be sending if we allowed this violation to pass without serious consequences. We would be teaching Daniel that his mother's feelings and preferences were less important than his wife's professional opinions. We would be teaching Cassandra that she could override other people's clearly stated boundaries as long as she claimed to be acting out of love and spent enough money to justify her actions. That night, I slept better than I had since we'd returned from Ireland. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own life and my own home. I didn't know whether Daniel and Cassandra would choose to restore the house or buy it from us, but either option would result in me living in a space that reflected my own choices rather than someone else's imposed vision. 3 days later, Daniel called to say that he and Cassandra had decided to have the house restored to its original condition. It wasn't an easy conversation, he admitted, and it had required several difficult discussions between him and his wife, but they both understood now that what they'd viewed as a generous gift had actually been a serious violation of our boundaries, and they wanted to make things right. The restoration process took 4 months and cost significantly more than the original renovation, partly because undoing changes is often more complex than making them in the first place. Cassandra supervised the work, but this time she consulted with me about every single decision. She asked to see photographs of how rooms had looked before. She requested my input on paint colors and finishes, and she made sure that I approved every choice before any work was done. I could tell that the process was difficult for her, both financially and emotionally. She had genuinely believed that her renovation was a wonderful gift, and having to undo all of that work while acknowledging that it had been unwelcome was clearly painful. But I also saw her beginning to understand why consent and respect are more important than good intentions or professional expertise. The most challenging aspect of the restoration was replacing items that had been donated to charity or otherwise disposed of. We couldn't recover my grandmother's china or the specific pieces of furniture that had held personal meaning, but Cassandra worked with antique dealers and estate sale companies to find similar items that could serve the same functions and carry new memories forward. She also surprised me by having Robert's built-in bookshelves professionally restored by a craftsman who specialized in period woodwork. The process was expensive and time-consuming, but the finished result looked even better than the original, and I could see how much thought and care had gone into making sure they matched Robert's original craftsmanship. During those 4 months, something interesting happened in our relationship with Daniel and Cassandra. The process of undoing the renovation forced all of us to have honest conversations about boundaries, respect, and different values. Cassandra began to understand that her professional training didn't give her the right to override other people's personal preferences, especially in their own homes. Daniel began to see how his support of his wife's project had essentially communicated to his parents that their feelings and comfort were less important than maintaining peace in his marriage. By the time the restoration was complete, we had developed a different kind of relationship, one based on clearer boundaries and more honest communication. Cassandra still occasionally made suggestions about home improvement projects, but now she asked for permission first and respected our decisions when we weren't interested. Daniel started calling us more often and visiting more regularly, not because he felt obligated to mediate between his wife and his parents, but because he genuinely enjoyed spending time in a home where everyone felt comfortable and respected. The final piece of the restoration was returning all of our family photographs to their original places on the walls. As I hung pictures documenting decades of birthdays and holidays and everyday moments, I felt like I was reclaiming not just my physical space, but my sense of identity and autonomy. Looking back on this experience, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about interior design or family dynamics, but about the importance of standing up for yourself when someone crosses fundamental boundaries. For months, I had tried to be the accommodating mother-in-law, the gracious woman who didn't make waves, even when that meant feeling uncomfortable in my own home and questioning my own choices and preferences. But accommodating someone else's behavior doesn't make you a good person if that behavior is fundamentally disrespectful. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to enforce clear consequences when they treat you poorly, even when they claim to be acting out of love. The house looks almost exactly the way it did before we left for Ireland, but it feels different now. It feels like a place where my boundaries are respected, where my preferences matter, where I have autonomy over my own living space. And perhaps most importantly, it feels like a place where I demonstrated that I value myself enough to demand respect from others, even when doing so was difficult and uncomfortable. That experience taught me that sometimes the best way to redecorate someone's attitude is to show them that there are real consequences when they treat you like your feelings don't matter. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone who has violated your boundaries isn't, "Please don't do that again," but rather, "This is what will happen if you ever do that again."
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.